On August 14, 1948, a twin-engine Beechcraft took off from McCall, Idaho, carrying 76 live beavers in wooden crates. The plane climbed to 700 feet above the Chamberlain Basin, a remote mountain valley in central Idaho with no roads, no permanent structures, and no way in except by air or a multi-day hike. One by one, the crates were pushed out of the door with surplus World War II parachutes strapped to the top. 75 of the 76 animals touched down alive. Nobody followed them in. Nobody monitored what happened next. Nobody wrote a management plan or scheduled a follow-up survey beyond a single check in the following year. For 77 years, those 75 beavers and their descendants were left entirely alone. Researchers examining the results today describe what happened to that valley as one of the most significant, unintentional ecosystem restoration experiments on the continent. The film documenting the original operation sat misclassified in a state archive for 65 years before anyone found it. Almost nobody knows this story. And the part that most people never hear is the part that matters most. Before European colonization, somewhere between 60 million and 400 million beavers occupied North America. Their dams shaped hundreds of thousands of square miles of wetland. Their ponds stored water during wet seasons and released it slowly during droughts. Their engineering connected streams to their flood plains in ways that kept the entire Western water system functional across centuries. Then the fur trade arrived. For 250 years, trappers drove what they sometimes called a mammalian gold rush. A single beaver pelt could command prices rivaling precious metals by weight. Entire colonial economies were mapped along the logic of where the beavers still were. When one region ran out, the trappers pushed west. By 1900, a population that had numbered in the hundreds of millions had collapsed to an estimated 100,000 animals. What followed was a hydrological catastrophe that most people have never connected to its cause. Without beaver dams holding water back across the landscape, streams cut faster and deeper through their beds. Floodplains dried out, water tables dropped. Rivers that had once moved through networks of slow, connected ponds became narrow, eroded ditches across the American West. By the 1930s, the federal government had begun relocating beavers back into parts of their historic range. The economics were straightforward. Relocating one beaver cost roughly $8. The estimated value of that beaver's hydrological work over its lifetime was calculated at around $300, a return of 36 times the initial investment, produced by an animal no one had to pay. But by 1945, Idaho had a problem that economics couldn't solve. Veterans and their families surged into the rural valleys around McCall and Payette Lake after the war ended. New development collided directly with beaver populations that had been recovering for a decade. Residents complained about flooded roads, blocked irrigation canals, and ornamental trees felled overnight. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game was receiving more calls every week. The traditional answer was to trap the beavers and move them to remote backcountry by horse or mule. The method was failing. Semi-aquatic animals strapped onto horses through hot summer mountain forests for hours at a time overheated, became physiologically stressed, refused food, and died in significant numbers in transit. Those that survived arrived weakened and disoriented. The man who changed the equation was Elmo W. Heater, a conservation officer for Idaho Fish and Game. Heater had noticed two things. The Chamberlain Basin was accessible by small aircraft, and the United States military had left behind enormous stockpiles of surplus parachutes sitting unused in warehouses. His proposal, later published in the Journal of Wildlife Management in 1950, was precise. Capture beavers near populated areas, load them into specially designed wooden crates, fly them over the Chamberlain Basin, push the crates out the door with parachutes attached, and design the crates to open automatically on impact, so the beavers could walk free without anyone present. The crate design was the critical engineering problem. Early prototypes either failed to open on landing, trapping the animals inside, or opened prematurely mid-fall. One version used willow twig baskets designed to weaken as the beaver chewed through them. Field tests showed the beavers simply sat there, confused, and did not chew. Heater spent weeks iterating at the McCall airstrip. He dropped empty boxes, then weighted boxes, then boxes with live animals, measuring impact forces and testing different elastic configurations from varying heights. The final design used two lidless wooden boxes hinged together, 30 by 12 by 8 inches, breathing holes drilled in the sides, with heavy 2-inch elastic bands fastened to the bottom acting as springs. Ropes held the halves shut during flight. On impact, the ropes snapped and the elastic forced the crate open automatically. Before the full operation could be approved, Heater needed proof. His test subject was an older male beaver he named Geronimo. Geronimo was loaded into a prototype crate, taken up in a small plane over Idaho, and pushed out from roughly 500 feet. The crate landed. The springs worked. The box opened. Geronimo walked out. Heater put him back in the crate and did it again. Over the testing phase, Geronimo was parachuted multiple times from varying altitudes. By the end, Heater described the beaver as so accustomed to the process that he would voluntarily crawl back into the crate for the next flight. That is not an embellishment. It is in the published paper. When the full operation was approved, Geronimo earned a spot on the first official flight. His reward for repeated service as the test subject was a one-way ticket to the Chamberlain Basin and permanent retirement alongside 3 young females chosen to accompany him. Over several days in August 1948, 76 beavers were parachuted into selected meadows across the Chamberlain Basin. Drop altitude ranged between 500 and 800 feet, high enough for full parachute deployment, low enough to keep descent time short. Officers selected sites based on water availability, vegetation cover, and distance from existing colonies. Each crate typically carried 2 beavers, balanced toward 1 male and 3 females, because field data showed younger beavers in small family units had the highest survival rates. 75 of 76 landed safely. The single casualty was a beaver that forced its way out of the crate during the fall and dropped without a parachute. Total cost, between $8 and $16 per animal, roughly $190 to $380 in today's money, including aircraft fuel, surplus parachutes, crate construction, and personnel time. Follow-up surveys in 1949 found something that surprised even Heater. The beavers had not scattered. Within months of landing in a valley none of them had ever seen, they had begun building dams on the streams flowing through their new territory. Pond systems were forming. Lodges were going up. Beaver dam construction is largely innate, triggered by the sound of running water and the presence of woody vegetation. Drop an adult beaver into suitable habitat, and within days it will begin identifying choke points in a stream and felling saplings. The animals did not need to learn what to do. They already knew. And what happened next is the part of this story that transforms it from a historical curiosity into something far larger. In 1980, the Chamberlain Basin and 2.3 million acres of surrounding mountain, forest, and canyon were officially designated as the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, one of the strictest forms of land protection in the United States, prohibiting roads, motorized vehicles, permanent structures, logging, mining, and any form of development. The politicians who drew the boundaries were protecting the landscape. The beavers, from their perspective, were part of the scenery. What the designation actually did was seal off the most significant long-duration beaver experiment on the continent from any possibility of human interference. Every other beaver restoration project in North America operates in landscapes where humans actively manage, disturb, or remove the animal's work. The Frank Church Wilderness became, entirely by accident, the control experiment that modern beaver science had never been able to design on purpose. 77 years of expanding beaver population. Zero direct human interference. Nobody clearing dams, nobody trapping animals, nobody building roads through the wetlands they created. The process is cumulative and self-reinforcing. A single beaver dam traps sediment, raises the stream bed, and spreads water across the floodplain. The water table rises. Willows, alders, and aspens colonize the wet zones, the same species beavers feed on and build with. The colony grows. New dams go up. Over decades, a single pond becomes a chain of connected wetlands stretching for miles along a valley floor. NASA Earth Observatory satellite imagery of the Frank Church Wilderness has documented wetland expansion across the basin, the precise signature of long-term beaver engineering across the original 1948 drop sites. The biodiversity effects follow the water. Chinook and steelhead salmon that spawn in central Idaho migrate more than 900 miles to the Pacific and return years later to the exact mountain streams where they hatched. Beaver ponds along those streams provide cold water refuge during summer heat and slow water habitat for juvenile fish that would not survive in overheated, free-flowing channels. In a region where wild salmon populations have declined catastrophically, beaver ponds are not a sentimental addition to the landscape. They are functioning hydrological infrastructure on which the salmon runs depend. And in 2025, as the American West faces increasingly severe drought and longer wildfire seasons, a second effect has become impossible to ignore. A peer-reviewed synthesis published in 2025 by Stanford University researchers confirmed the role of beaver-engineered landscapes in climate resilience, specifically their capacity to retain water during drought years and slow flood flows during storms. Satellite imagery from recent western megafires has documented that beaver-engineered wetlands act as fire refugia, saturated green patches in burned forest where vegetation survived, wildlife sheltered, and the fire either slowed or stopped entirely. A beaver pond does not just hold water in a burning landscape, it holds life. Elmo Heater never lived to see his work reappraised. He died decades before Sharon Clark, an Idaho fish and game historian, rediscovered the original 1948 film in 2015, misclassified and buried in the state archives for 65 years. He died decades before climate researchers began citing beaver-engineered landscapes as models for watershed resilience across the West. What Heater knew at the time was that his method worked, that it was cheap, and that the beavers survived the fall. What he could not have known was that the ecological compound interest of his August 1948 operation would still be paying out 77 years later. In salmon runs, in drought-resistant stream corridors, in green fire breaks inside burning forests, across 2.3 million acres of protected wilderness that nobody manages and nobody controls. 75 beavers, surplus parachutes, a test animal named Geronimo who learned to walk back into his own crate, and a valley that has been running its own experiment without asking permission ever since.